Well, I see a lot of familiar faces, so some of you will already know this mug. You're used to this. I'm Heather Wright. I work with Carers Link. I'm their neurodivergent support worker. My background is that I was an occupational therapist, retired from the health board, and duly started working with the Autism Resource Centre and then with carer organisations. I have a bit of a passion about neurodivergence. I finished my career as an OT in learning disabilities, which is of course part of the neurodivergent family. I specialised in profound and complex learning disability, autism and sensory processing disorder, and did additional training in those two subjects as well. I am neurodivergent and I have 3 neurodivergent sons. So my kind of catchphrase is worked it, lived it, raised it. And that's why I'm still around, because it's not easy, is it? You know, raising a family of neurodivergence, and if you're neurodivergent yourself, raising a family of neurodivergence, it's tough. Last week we talked about the autism identity, and it's very relevant to me that these two have come right next to each other, because the stuff we're going to talk about tonight about masking and about burnout, I think are very strongly linked to that identity. As human beings, we like to feel safe. To feel safe, we often feel that we need a protection around us. And that protection is our family, our tribe, our pack. So if we do not feel that we have somebody watching our back, we have somebody who understands us for who we are and accepts us and supports us and loves us with all our lumps, bumps and crazy bits, then how do we feel safe? And we feel safe by trying to fit into some tribe. And if that tribe doesn't have that understanding and that tolerance, we end up masking. So what we do is we try to fit by creating the image that other people provide and accept. The trouble with that is that's not us. You know? And I spoke last week about the importance of actually identifying who you are. Now I don't think that just applies to neurodivergence, it applies to every human on the planet. Every individual is unique, but as neurodivergents, we are different from others. The others which are the normal, accepted patterning, possibly. It's a bit crazy, really, because the evidence would suggest that neurodivergence is now something between 55 and 65% of the population. Is that right? Not autism, but neurodivergence. Yeah?
Depends how you define it.
Oh, yeah. So there's, you know. In which case, neurotypical isn't typical anymore. It might be the biggest tribe, but it's not necessarily the biggest, you know, group on the planet. But if we stop and look at it, the world out there is designed by the people who are in the neurotypical platform, normally. They're the people with the power and the choices and so a large percentage of the world out there is actually dictated by people who do not have an understanding of the neurodivergent mind. We're just weird, we're just peculiar, and no, well, they'll just get used to it. You know, what do you mean that you don't like touch? You know, well, you'll be okay. Maybe we'll put you in an aversion therapy course and you'll suddenly manage to tolerate people touching you. No! But there's this belief that if I don't feel that, it's really quite funny, the idea that sort of autism sees the world from their perspective, and that's a fault in the autistic individual. Yeah. Isn't that the normal practice of things? Oh, they've got this thing called theory of mind. You know, they don't get it. And I'm thinking, well, actually, do you know, they now call it double empathy for a reason. Because all these other people don't get it, you know? So if you don't understand your own identity, if you don't feel comfortable with who you are, feel that you are surrounded by a group of individuals, whether they be actually genetic family members, or whether they be peer groups of a similar mindset and feeling and understanding and emotional platform as yourselves, then you feel vulnerable. So you then start to mask. You start to mimic. Now, sometimes that's deliberate, but a lot of the time it isn't. It's not as if, particularly our young people, are desperately trying to be like. I mean, I think that definitely happens in teens. I mean, that happens in teens across the entire teen population. It's not just a neurodivergent teen population, you know, I've got to be like this person on social media, or these people that are in my class or year at school or whatever. But even very young children will start to mimic and copy the people around them. And the more they get criticized or focused on or made to feel uncomfortable for not being the same as, the harder they will try to fit. And as I say, is it a conscious thing? I think sometimes it is. And sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it just becomes, this is what I am supposed to be. And if they don't have a true understanding of, well, that's not me, then how do they ever step back from the mask? As a child, I learned to do what people expected of me to do. But I went home to a family who accepted me as I was, which was extremely different to my older sister, who was quiet and intellectual and very biddable and not particularly, sort of physical. I was a kangaroo. I sounded like a foghorn, and I could not organize myself to get from the bedroom to the bathroom in the mornings, But that was fine. My mother organized me. She created a world in which I could function and just accepted that that was me. So I didn't have to mask at home. And I was very lucky. I grew up in a cul-de-sac on the outskirts of town, and there were 8 kids. And the others just said, well, that's Heather, she is her. Weird, but, we love her anyway. So I was actually surrounded by that tribe. None of them were neurodivergent, as far as I can remember, but they just accepted me as me. But when I went to school, I spent the whole day at school being something else. It's exhausting, isn't it? Trying to be something you're not, but you know that they won't accept you otherwise. So in my case, by the time I got to about primary 2, I'd got it. I'd got the fact that I have to physically work at being something different. And by the time I got to P4 and had moved out of that safe little world in Ayrshire into Glasgow, I had learned to mask, and my God, I needed it. Because I was bullied stupid, because I was weird. So I had learned by that time that it needed to be done. So you mask either subconsciously to a certain extent or deliberately. But all the time you are masking, you are denying who you really are. And the question is it more dangerous for somebody who denies that that's the case or somebody who actually knows they're doing it? And I think it's more dangerous for the former, because they start to lose their own identity and start to become something that they don't feel comfortable in, but that they feel they have to do to exist. What damage does that do? Because you will never, ever fit. You won't fit in your own head, no matter about everybody else's. So you keep presenting this persona of something that isn't really you. And you never feel included, and you never feel safe, and you live constantly with an autonomic system which is telling you you're not safe. And that's what burnout's all about. Because we can't live like that. We need to feel safe. If we don't feel safe, our autonomic system will start to fight back. And you will start to be exhausted, physically exhausted, emotionally exhausted. Your muscles will be constantly tense, so you will get pains. You will get physical pains. You will start to get headaches. You will start to get stomach cramps. You will start to produce all sorts of chemicals in your body, which then results in skin irritations and all the rest of it. So your physical and mental state becomes unsustainable. And you can do that for just so long until finally your body just says enough, and it stops. When I first retired from the health service 13 years ago, and I was working with the Autism Resource Centre, I'd seen a couple of burnout cases. They were all adult. And then a couple of years ago, I encountered my first primary school age burnout. I was horrified, absolutely horrified. An 8-year-old child who was in typical autism burnout, almost completely catatonic. Since then, I've encountered 7. What's happening? What sort of society do we live in? The trouble is that our children are praised for behaving well, for being normal, as if somehow that's a wonderful thing to be. See, look, they're managing fine. They're doing what they're supposed to do. Isn't that great? No. It's interesting, I developed supporting me through learning communication passport many years ago now, probably very first training thing that I did with Carers Link. It was obvious that something like this was needed. And it's now on its 4th redevelopment. And on the last one, there's an entire section on masking put into that. Because I'm convinced all of those children that I have encountered with masking, all of them were doing so well at school until suddenly they weren't. And their parents were clear that they were masking, and they tried to tell the school that there were problems, and the school said, "We don't encounter any difficulties, they're fine. They're fine when they're at school. Don't worry about them." And several of them are 3-4 years down the line now, having not been able to go back to education because Their autonomic system is now so overloaded that it's telling them nothing is safe. So trying to create a safe world, demand avoidance, pathological demand avoidance exists because the autonomic system is producing chemicals constantly which says, you're not safe, you're not safe, you're not safe. So it's not about, I'm just exhausted because my life is stressful. Their whole chemistry and body has changed because their body's telling them that the world out there is not a safe place to be. So it's not about, well, if we reduce the impact a little bit, if we just ask them to come into school for half a day instead of a full day, or maybe 3 days a week instead of 5, they'll be fine. We won't overload them, we won't give them too much. Or, you can reduce your hours at work, you'll be fine. No, because the minute you walk through the door, your autonomic system screams at you and says, I'm not safe, please run away. Or shut down. So they'll either freeze or they'll flee. And if they're cornered, they'll fight. So burnout is very much about, can you actually survive in a world that does not constantly tell you you're not safe? So recovery from burnout is about providing that individual with a world that is completely safe for them. That's an incredibly difficult thing to do. And I've encountered, unfortunately, several teenage boys who have literally shut themselves inside their bedrooms because they're the only safe place to be. And people say, well, if we can just get them back to school for a couple of hours. And I said, you can't get them out the room, no matter about out the house, no matter about... And as the OT in me has gone back to square one with these families and said, we get them out the room and downstairs when there's nobody else downstairs. You leave their dinner on the table and leave. I said, then you start to get them down when they're in a safe place with other people, i.e. their family. I said, then you get them, if you've got it, out and into the car and you go for a drive. You don't stop, you don't get out, you just, look, the world's still out here. I said, 6 months down the line, you may be actually able to stop off and go for a McDonald's or whatever. But I'm talking about 6 months down the line. I mean, as an OT working in learning disability, I had providers who said, can you teach them to use cutlery, please? And I said, well, can you teach them to finger feed? Because you've got somebody who's not finger feeding. Would you try to teach a baby to use a knife and fork before they actually start to lift their feeder cup or their milk bottle? No, you wouldn't think about it. You start back there. You start back where this is achievable. And achievable is, can I get into a place which is safe? So the demand has to be entirely around about that person's capacity at that moment in time, not anybody else's agenda, their agenda. Well, actually today, I feel like I can maybe do this. No, I said yesterday I would, but I can't today. Well, that's fine. Actually, that's fine. Today's today, maybe tomorrow. So there's this big push when our kids go, and our adults go into burnout. How quickly can we get them back on the treadmill? We need to completely retrain them to the fact that they can identify a world which suits them. They can identify their personal identity and then create a world that identity can live in. Okay? On your tables, there's some handouts which I produced, which are various websites that I've encountered, which had some useful information in them. Unfortunately, several of them are American, because that's where you find a lot of the stuff, and several of them are ADDs rather than ASDs. Now, that's not just because I'm an ADD and that's where I tend to look. I find that the materials around about, the practical materials around about executive skills, and in fact, I discovered in burnout, are better in those particular websites. So I don't think it's well, this would apply to an ADD, but my person's ASD. I think the issues are very much the same. The autonomic system problems, the demand problems, they're the same for both populations. And a large number of our people, of course, are dual diagnosis anyway. So there's actually quite a lot of evidence that there's bigger problems of masking for dual combinations. Because, you know, which pathway do you choose? Am I the crazy Heather person, or am I the sort of hermit snail person? You know, I mean, and you can't make up your mind yourself. So it's really difficult to actually create some form of mask which fits you at all. So the stuff's there if anybody wants to ask more questions about it. You can ask anything now or wait for the panel.